First of all, we want to say thank you for being part of Prophetic, the Public Theology Fellowship. This fellowship has now been running for 8 weeks, and I think we've been having a profoundly rich time of learning together with some incredible faculty, some incredible sharing of conversation, and stirring of the imagination. I want to continue naming the sense of grief, the sense of sorrow. We've heard words like powerless, helpless. There's been a sense of grieving the suffering of your neighbors that you've been missing in your areas of public life, the students you work with. And we want to say that the naming of this lamentation and mourning is part of our practice. And it's not something that we run away from, it's something that we embrace and we hold together. And so if you're coming in today with joy and hope, that's welcome. And if you're coming in with tears, with questions, with heaviness, with fears, they are also welcome, and we will carry them together. So thank you for your participation in this fellowship, and we are so grateful to share community with you. I want to begin again by naming deep gratitude for Chase's leadership in facilitating this fellowship and just the wonderfully insightful questions that she's been modeling with each of our faculty. And again, the invitation she's been offering us each week to dwell in the love of God and to discern what is ours to say and do. So deeply grateful for you, Chase. Two quick updates. The first is we have a request for you, dear fellows. And our request is to extend this fellowship by 2 weeks. We would like to ask you to stay on with us for 2 weeks, so that'll be week 11 and week 12. And the reason why we're asking for this is we've just been having a really, really rich fellowship together, and we don't want to end this abruptly to just basically say bye. We want to really enter into a process of integrating what we've been learning, of sharing with one another what's in our hearts, and discerning how we can continue to encourage and support one another moving forward. So we would like to request for you 2 extra weeks. Excuse me, let me open my calendar and just so that would be April 12th and April 19th. I'd like to ask if you can stay on with us from April 12th and April 19th, and that will give us time to just do some more integration, some celebration, and some expression of the needs and desires that we have moving forward. And Chase and I would request, if you're unable to stay with us April 12th and 19th, would you kindly send us an email and simply let us know? And if you can't, we understand because this was not part of the original schedule that we invited you to sign on for. So there's no shame, there's no pressure if you can't. But if you can't, kindly send Chase and I an email just so we can be aware that you're not able to join us for that week. And Matt, we're doing a little housework here, so thank you for your patience. I'm going to introduce you in just one moment.
Please take your time.
Thank you. I want to bring to your attention, friends, that we have our final project coming up on April 5th. So this is in 2 weeks, and our final project is called the Public Theology Manifesto. And I simply want to read the instructions to you. We are spending 10 weeks reflecting on public theology. For your final learning task, articulate your current convictions in response to these core questions. And these are the questions we've been asking over and over in this fellowship. What is public theology? Number one, what is public theology? Number two, why does public theology matter? Number three, how do you intend to practice public theology moving forward? The intention of this assignment is to harvest your learning during the fellowship and to build a foundation for continued learning and practice throughout your life and vocation. As you reflect and write your public theology manifesto. Be authentic, creative, and take risks. And I want to emphasize that. Be authentic, be yourself, be creative, and take risks. Also, make sure to integrate the following guidelines. First, review your weekly session notes and your prophetic practice forms. As you write your manifesto, refer to at least 5 of our faculty members with whom we have shared appreciative presence, attentive listening, respectful questioning, and mutual learning throughout the fellowship. Integrate what you have learned from them as you reflect on your own vision of public theology. This might include highlighting their particularly illuminating uses of language, places where they have helped you clarify and or change your heart and mind, or memorable examples from their practice. So we'd like to see just 5 moments in your manifesto where you say, this reminds me of Reverend Molo saying, I want to be a disturbing presence in the halls of my churches. Or I agree with Munther Isak that practicing public theology and critiquing injustice is a pastoral duty. Or I was inspired by Professor McBride to live in mutually transformative relationships. We just like you to review your notes and as you're writing your own manifesto, to integrate 5 moments, whether it's a phrase, it's a quotation, it's a practice that you learned from our faculty. Second, in the first section of your manifesto, be sure to offer a crisp, clear definition of public theology and then unpack it so it is clear and compelling. So we'd love to just have a one sentence, I believe public theology is boom, boom, boom. And then you can unpack that in a few sentences. But we'd like you to really put public theology in your own words. It doesn't need to be a perfect definition. It doesn't need to be a total definition, but we'd like to try to get it in one clear sentence. Third, in section 2, be sure to articulate at least 3 reasons why public theology matters for better and for worse. And I say for better and for worse because maybe you say public theology matters because it can help shape the moral imagination of the community. And that's a way where public theology is helpful. Or you might take a critical lens and you say public theology matters because religion has institutionalized dehumanization in my society. And that needs to be dismantled. Again, referring to Reverend Molo, how he said he has an ambivalent relationship with his religion. We want you to articulate at least 3 reasons why you think public theology matters in your context. Third, in section 3, articulate at least 3 practices of public theology that you intend to incorporate in your life and vocation moving forward. Each should be captured in a simple statement. For example, I will speak out when I observe significant public injustice in my society. And then again, unpack and support these 3 practices as necessary. So just you can give a brief description saying what you mean by each of your practices. And we realize that this is tricky. So maybe one of your practices of public theology is to get in touch with your grief and to better understand that sense of, oh, I feel powerless, rather than allowing that to control you, to understand it, to work through it. Whatever your practices of public theology are, we're excited to read them and to see how you unpack them. Also, in the 3rd section of your manifesto, be sure to include your response to these questions. How should people of faith respond in situations of significant public injustice? Is prayer enough? Is silence acceptable? Hassait, for example, in her midterm, talked about how people of faith should come out in public and engage in public demonstrations and even protests to name their commitment to justice, to human dignity, to the rule of law. So we'd like to hear from you. How should people of faith respond in situations of significant public injustice? And second, do your convictions, or Christian convictions, compel you to accept or reject the use of violence mostly lethal or permanently debilitating violence when confronting evil. Why? So we'd like to hear, what is your current conviction about the use of violence in confronting evil? Do you think that um, people should be committed to the practice of nonviolence? Do you think that there are legitimate reasons for using violence? We'd like to hear from you on that. And you're going to have an opportunity to present a summary of your manifesto now, not in our final April 5th session, but in our April 12th session. So, friends, we're really looking forward to learning from you. And this is not to put pressure on you, but rather to harvest learning. What does public theology mean to you? Why do you think it matters? How do you intend to practice it? And there's one thing that I didn't put on the syllabus, Matt, a professor mistake here. We'd like your
Mhm.
syllabus to be around 1,500 words, 1,500 words. So if you think you have, 100, 200 words for intro, and then you have 400 words for what is public theology, why does it matter, how do you practice it, and then a little conclusion. Um, as you can see, we're not looking for anything long from you, about 1,500 words where you can just clearly state what's in your heart. This is not meant to be an overwhelming assignment, but just an assignment where your heart and mind can breathe. Okay, thank you, dear friends. Again, if you're not able to stay on with us for April 12th and April 19th, we kindly ask you to email Chase and I. We are hoping to extend this fellowship by 2 weeks if you're just joining more recently. Okay, now it's my great joy and honor to introduce Professor Matthew Vega. I have known Professor Vega, my dear friend Matt, for at least 25 years.
Mhm.
I got to know Matt when we were both youth, um, living in some pretty rough neighborhoods outside Chicago. And a friendship developed between us. And Matt um, is a person I will always remember for quoting the speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from memory. And Matt had internalized the preaching and the ethic of Dr. King in the face of American racism, American militarism, American acceptance of poverty, and the othering of whole groups of Americans. I just loved Matt, how the words and the spirit of Dr. King were so alive in him. And then Matt went on to do a master's and a PhD in theology and ethics at the University of Chicago. And Matt's dissertation was focusing on a Blaxican theology. He was integrating a Black and Mexican theology and asking, what do these two traditions of theology have to learn from one another, and how can they generate new theological imagination and practice that is liberatory for all of us moving forward? And in the American context, Matt may say more about this. Um, Black neighbors and Mexican neighbors don't always get along, and they don't always see one another with a lot of affection. And so this work of asking how can we construct a Blaxican theology is very innovative and very groundbreaking. And I love the daring courage and creativity of your theological imagination, Matt. Matt's now a professor of theology at the University of San Diego. It's on the west coast of the United States, and Matt is an expert in liberation theology, the relationship of race and religion. Matt has a deep interest in the relationship of capitalism, Marxism, and religion. So, Matt, we are so eager to learn from you today um, and are so grateful for your presence. Thank you, dear brother.
Oh, I love you, my dear brother Andrew. Our roots do go very, very deep. Thank you, Andrew, Chase, Tekalane, and to everyone who is here for joining. I'm delighted to spend virtual time with each of you from afar. I have very fond memories of Ethiopia. My very first time ever leaving the country was when I was 20 years old. and I flew with a team to Ethiopia, and I would stay up late playing this Bible game that we called Extreme Bible Challenge. And Andrew and I believe, were on the same team. And so the game was intense. So you'd have this isn't the Bible, but you have a Bible, and someone would open it up to a random place and just randomly pick a place to lay their finger on a random verse in the Bible, and you'd have to guess where in the Bible it was from. So if you got book, chapter, and verse in the Bible, if you have those wrong, you'd have to do 15 push-ups, 5 push-ups for each, for book, chapter, and verse. But if you got all 3 correct, you could stack them onto someone else, an opponent. So Andrew and I were on the same team, and let's just say we were getting strong spiritually. We were, but we were definitely not getting much stronger physically. But I remember vividly the dances, the villages, the landscape, the food of Ethiopia. And it was the first place that allowed me to expand my horizons and to begin to think globally, to think about the global church, global justice movements, international politics, about comparative cultures. So I'm a seganalo for having me. As Andrew mentioned, I am an assistant professor at University of San Diego. I teach courses on religion, race, class. And this semester, I'm actually teaching a course on liberation theology. And so this evening, I want to share some thoughts about liberation theology's relationship to the public, or the public sphere. But I'm not entirely sure how familiar you all might be with liberation theology. So I might say 2 things before I discuss its relationship to the public. First, just a very, very brief, and I mean a pathetically brief history. And then perhaps a word of clarity about the 2 terms, liberation and theology. When I first started this semester off teaching liberation theology, I made just a really poor assumption about how familiar my students were with it. So I think it's just important just to maybe just mention what it is before we talk a little bit about its relationship to the public. If at any point this feels too technical or unclear, I hope we can make time to just make these ideas as clear as we can during discussion, and discuss their import for all of you here, wherever you might be. So in the Christian tradition, liberation theology is often seen as kind of a more progressive interpretation of Christian scripture, tradition, and experience. I don't mean that it's new or edgy, but that it's perceived as connecting progressive politics with oftentimes conservative or traditional understanding of Christian theology. It emerged in the late 1960s as a response to global political and social movements for liberation, civil rights, decolonization, and other social justice movements. It's often associated with Latin American Catholicism and the 1971 publication of the Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez. And Gutierrez often defined theology as critical reflection on praxis in light of the Word of God. So it's reflection on life, essentially on history. It really mentions history. So for him, he argued history is the first step, that Christians live in the world, and then they critically analyze the political, economic, and social dimensions of history before moving to theology. He said theology is the second step. And so liberation theology, in this sense, is understood as a kind of critical interpretation of history, or as the Hasidic Jewish rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel once put it. He was before Gutierrez, but I really like the way that he uses this phrase, an exegesis of existence from a divine perspective. I think that's actually a really what liberation theology is often about. However, Gustavo Gutierrez published his 1970 before Gustavo Gutierrez published his 1971 text, A Theology of Liberation, Teología de la Liberación, and then it was translated in English, A Theology of Liberation, in 1973. An African-American theologian from rural Arkansas by the name of James Cone published two books beforehand, Black Theology and Black Power in 1969, and then A Black Theology of Liberation in 1970. So those two figures, so I mentioned that not to litigate, who was first, but these are, I think sometimes it's important to recognize that these two are seen as often understood as the kind of fathers of liberation theology, James Cone and Gustavo Gutierrez. But liberation theology has expanded and has emerged in all parts of the world, from the continent of Africa to Asia and beyond. One of the things that liberation theology recognizes is that that a lot of them recognizes that liberation lies at the heart of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and there's an orientation or a commitment, a sense of a calling to justice for the poor, the oppressed, and those on the underside of society. That's really at the heart of liberation theology. Again, that's a really, really, really short history, and I'll just say one brief word about the two words, liberation and theology. So liberation, many of the writers in liberation theology, am I speaking too fast? Am I good? Give me a thumbs up if we're good. Okay, great. Many of the writers in liberation theology see liberation as the essence, the kernel, or the content of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So rather than say love or grace, these theologians identify liberation as the core of the Christian message, and therefore prioritize clarifying its essential meaning. So those two so-called fathers, Gustavo Gutierrez and James Cone, each in their respective works, they provide space for defining those terms themselves. Gutierrez, in the very beginning of his book, in the first part, and Cone has a whole chapter in one of his books called God of the Oppressed in 1975, and just titled The Meaning of Liberation. Suffice it to say that for both of them, and especially for Cone, there's two dimensions of liberation. There's an eschatological dimension. We're not going to talk about that, but for both of them, liberation is not understood as a destination. It's not like, oh, I've arrived at liberation. For both of them, liberation is a praxis. It's a way of being in the world in light of God's word. So one does liberation by defying unjust social, economic, and cultural and political ensnarements of the world. Liberation theologians, for example, have sought liberation from settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, economic exploitation. Excuse me. Thought a sneeze was coming upon me. And other forms of domination. And so all these fall under the kind of umbrella category of liberation theology, since all of them are in the praxis of performing a kind of counter life, or a kingdom life of freedom that God intended for humanity. For many theologians, myself included, if I can call myself one, is that the defining attribute of God is free. So there are many ways that we can describe God. You can describe God as loving, describe God, but every time we say things about God, we're using human speech, which is a creation of God. We're using human speech to say something about God. And God is free. God can't be contained by our speech. God is free from all human speech and all human interests, and human beings, we often create idols that take hold in society that we consider to be eternal. So for a lot of people, for a lot of liberation theologians, those idols can be capitalist exploitation. We might take it as a given, right? We might cite passages like "the poor will always be with you" as a way of fixing kind of inequality, poverty and inequality as a kind of fixture of human life. We might see it as a fixed system that God ordains, but God is free from being confined to any understanding that we might have about how the world operates. Jesus is free from the way we think of or define him, say as a white-skinned, blonde-haired savior. God is free, and so liberation theologians are bearing God's image by kind of enacting or embodying freedom as well. So that's liberation, kind of in a short. We can have more conversation about that. So liberation, brief history. We mentioned liberation. Theology is a kind of more difficult part, and all of them kind of define theology differently. So it's a bit since my time as an undergraduate student in theology at Wheaton College, I've wrestled with providing a definition of theology, its relationship to churches, publics, and other communities. I think it's interpreted differently across time, space, and tradition. So for me, in short, theology, in short, is a meaning-making discipline given by God, the Creator. God has given all of life meaning, and we also bear God's image in the world by doing so. God has named the world. God has evaluated the world, not just kind of seen the world, but evaluated it, called it good, and we bear God's image by also being those kind of restorative agents of God's goodness in the world, where God's goodness has been tainted. It's kind of theology in kind of nutshell. And so liberation theology, in short, is a way of being attentive to God, revealing God's self in the world through struggles for human freedom and dignity. Much more can be said about this during our discussion. Would love that. But let's talk about, I want to focus on liberation theology and its relationship to the public sphere. Liberation theology, I don't know if we make space for like time questions, or we'll do that later. I don't, because I just don't know if I'm moving fast. Okay.
You're doing great, Matt. And Chase is going to do a focused interview with you for a few minutes after you finish your lecture, and then the rest of the time will be open to Q&A. So we're good.
Great. Okay. Awesome. So liberation theology has been characterized as a political, practical, public, and prophetic form of theology. There's in 1986, for example, there were two liberation theologians from Brazil. They wrote an introductory text to liberation theology. It was called "Introducing Liberation Theology." Names are Leonardo and Clodovis Boff. And they refer to liberation theology as a public and prophetic theology that, quote, has spread the boundaries of the church and today is in the public domain, unquote. So what constitutes its publicness? For them, liberation theology spread into the public domain can be discerned through the influence it's exerted on civil society. So civil society, so for them, that includes the media and the universities, and the political domain. So it's kind of influence and the way that you see it in political spheres among leaders and institutions, good or bad, right? Good or bad. We've seen here in the United States, when and during the 2008 presidential election of Barack Obama, we also saw there was a conversation happening about liberation theology, Black liberation theology specifically. So, I want to build on their important insight by clarifying the type of publics that I think liberation theologies are immersed in and attend to. So my claim we could talk about this, is that the sources and communities liberation theology attends to are found in what Black American political theorist Michael Dawson refers to as counterpublics, or ostracized publics, which kind of emerge on the outskirts of the broader public sphere. I had the wonderful opportunity of working really closely with Michael Dawson at the University of Chicago. He administered one of my exams. We did a lot of work together on histories and theories of race and capitalism. So, of course, I'm going to cite him. He's like, it's what we do. We go to school, we study under someone, and then we just like regurgitate all the things that they say. That's not true. Sort of. So counterpublics. An example. So in almost every liberal democracy, a lot of us do have an idea of what's considered the public. The examples that Leonardo and Clodovis Boff gave were like the media and like universities. So, perhaps we imagine the public is at least represented in the news. So here in the United States, what we see on maybe Fox, CNN, MSNBC, these are important media outlets in the United States, corporate-owned media outlets. I'm not sure what the corporate-owned, or if there are corporate-owned media outlets in Ethiopia, or if it's independently funded, or in Latin America or elsewhere. So that's one form of the media. We might also think of social media as representing the public and a space where we can kind of share our ideas. So Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. What else was mentioned? Civil society or university. Perhaps we suspect that the public can be discerned by whatever ideas are circulating within university settings and campuses. So I think for me, one of the issues that with recognizing these spaces as publics, it's kind of my own maybe interaction with the Boff brothers, if I might clarify or challenge, is that many of them are privately owned and corporately funded. So we don't necessarily invest in these news outlets. And if we do, we are outbid by billionaires who prefer to air the stories that they imagine are important for us to know. So there's an incentive to keep some of these ideas hidden from broader audiences. This has really become important for me in the last year. There's been widespread concern about censorship, shadow banning. That's a term where some of the things that you're sharing are being kind of banned, but in a kind of secret way, like from being seen by other people on your social media like network and on on social media platforms. So I've seen this and I've experienced this. So many people, for instance, have just an example, have seen how ideas that are critical of the state of Israel are not allowed on many of these privately owned platforms that we consider publics. And ideas which are brought into the more public settings, say, where people organize to express their opinions at protests, they're often met with swift, violent responses by police or government officials. Therefore, what we imagine to be the public often turns out to be a kind of exclusive elite public that places profit over the public good. And so we're beginning to see this within university settings in the United States as well. The current president of the United States, Donald Trump, has threatened to withhold $400 million from Columbia University unless they expel students who participated in protests against the state of Israel, unless they ban masks on campus so that artificial intelligence facial recognition can identify them, and then redefine their definitions of anti-Semitism to include criticism of the state of Israel. So Columbia has agreed to I think the great majority, if not all, of the White House's demands in order to procure federal funding. And so we recognize that even on university campuses, the public circulation of ideas might not be allowed on those campuses as well. And so back to Michael Dawson, he argues that Black Americans have historically been excluded from broader publics, but that didn't stop them, in that they invented what he called counterpublics historically. And so whenever these counterpublics were institutionalized, different ideas were able to enter. So he names a variety of kind of excluded ideas. Radical egalitarianism. He mentions disillusioned liberalism. He mentions Black Marxism. He mentions Black conservatism, Black feminism, Black nationalism. They're kind of different ways of imagining approaches that were the best and most appropriate to achieve Black liberation or Black freedom. But what's interesting, at least for me, is that these publics had different aims in mind. So they weren't there in the public to compete with other ideas like, whether Black people should be enslaved or have their voting rights taken away. They were there, and the goal itself was not, which idea is more persuasive, just for persuasion's sake. It wasn't understood necessarily as a kind of marketplace of ideas where reason kind of adjudicates between them. Similarly, I think we can imagine counterpublics as a way is like, we're not debating whether criticism of a state committing genocide is tantamount to anti-Semitism. That idea is not necessarily up for debate. So ideas that were not allowed, those ideas were not allowed are not allowed in counterpublics. So there are aspects of exclusion, and so Dawson argues that those ideas were not criticizing Black folks or whatever are not allowed in the counterpublic, but the counterpublic was concerned with the best way to achieve freedom, and those ideas were the ones that were debated. Those ideas were the ones that were debated. And so those approaches are they're debated within Black counterpublics, not within liberal publics. If we attend to our most accessible and dominant publics, we notice that they're not interested in debating the best pathway towards liberation. It's not interested in the liberation of colonized people or oppressed people generally. Turn on the news and you'll see that many, at least in the United States, American media is, now I'm just kind of giving my own, I think, opinion on this, but I think that others would say this as well, that it's really, a lot of it is entertainment. I don't know if that's fair to say, but I think a lot of American media is really entertainment. I think I was just talking with Andrew briefly about this not the other day. I think we were talking about the news, and you had mentioned a book that you had made you think of. I think The Medium is the Message, or something along those lines. Many publics are interested in a kind of common, white elite, whatever, good that may include the betterment of Black people, but on kind of strictly, on strictly, let's say, liberal terms. So liberation theology, so if it's, just to be clear, I believe liberation theology should be a public discipline insofar as it's a discipline or a theology committed to those ostracized publics. Indeed, I argue that liberation theology is only liberation theology when it emerges from and is attended to counter publics. And when I say that claiming liberation theology is a counter public model, that's slightly different from saying that ideas emerge from particular social contexts. All right, so James Cone, the gentleman that I mentioned earlier, one of the so-called fathers of liberation theology, he, paraphrasing Marx, suggests, quote, ideas do not have an independent existence, but are from beginning to end a social product. In a counter-public model, that's not what I'm saying. Theologians are not simply interested in the ideas that generate from particular social locations, but with the spaces that grant access to those socially determined ideas, not with presuppositions, but with the space for converting those presuppositions. So social locations generate tons of ideas, myriad ideas, but only a few of them are legitimized by liberal publics by gaining access to its sphere. So ideas might be considered too radical, unrealistic, absurd in light of the existing structures of legitimation. But I think what's amazing is that counterpublics emerge as spaces to debate the unreasonable, the ludicrous, the impossible, the kind of that will never happen ideas. There's no way we can imagine a society where there's no hierarchy. That's where the counterpublic, I think, is most remarkable. And I think we just don't have time for this, but this is where I also think Luther might be somewhat interesting to enter to Martin Luther, not the king, but the reformer, the monk. Right, because he recognizes that sometimes what we consider to be the reasonable, the rational, might actually just be a product of our own sinful hearts. That's an aside. I've written about this elsewhere. Not going to go into it right now. How much more do I want to say? Where am I on time?
We want to start transitioning to Q&A pretty soon, Matt. You're good.
Let's okay, so let me just say, I'll just finish here. So I think that there's a lot of different ways of thinking about theology and its relationship to the public. We could talk about those, post-liberal model, a kind of where ideas are only understood within one's own group. The kind of Chicago model or the Tracian model. But I think that I want to argue that liberation theology shouldn't seek legitimacy nor relevance within a bourgeois public, but instead locate itself within counterpublics. And that to make this decision it's not just a methodological decision, but it's a theological one, because it pursues the spaces discredited as absurd and unrealistic. And that in its pursuit, it finds the kind of requisite resources for constructing the proper theology of liberation. Publics provide spaces for debating and constructing the pathway for an esteemed good. And a counterpublic model distinguishes and differentiates among publics, and it sees liberation of an oppressed community as its desired good. And so this intended conscious aim motivates one's gathering of the sources necessary to carry out its task. And those sources are pursued and given epistemic authority, not infallibility, in light of their exclusion. Liberation theological model sees the exclusivity of many publics and opts for arenas where the practices for struggle are vied for and resources are made available. Therefore, liberation theology is a counter-public theology. It's a counter-public theology. Liberation theology is a counter-public theology. It is not always legitimated by value-neutral critical reason, and it gathers resources from spaces where unrealistic ideas abound. For me, a lot of this was motivated by what I sense was a kind of, this is getting a little bit off the, just anecdotally here. It felt like a waste of time and energy to try convincing people who are not committed to liberation to commit to liberation. I didn't. This is why I've learned to conserve a lot of my energy debating folks who I felt were not in good faith interested in what I believed was important, or to search for to look for allies like in the extreme right-wing spaces, extreme, to express sympathy for let's say, Palestinians, because I don't think their sympathy leads to anything liberative. But I want to encourage you today to find those counterpublics. They could be weekly gatherings at your home where you share and debate ideas. They could be at your local church. They could be at your barbershop. I think Michael Dawson talks about the barbershop being a counterpublic space. But wherever you are gathered, there the spirit of liberation will be present, guiding you towards the promised land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. There's so much there, and at least for me, so many new ideas that I've not heard, and terms I've not heard, like publics and counterpublics. So thank you for inviting us into that new form of imagination. Okay, I'm going to have a time of just asking a few questions to guide us in our conversation, and then in about 10 to 15 minutes, we'll transition into Q&A with our fellows. So everyone, as usual, be thinking, writing down what questions you'd like to ask Dr. Vega. No question too small, so be brave. Okay, my first question for you, Matt. For those of us who aren't super familiar with liberation theology, publics, counterpublics, could you, as you were saying, in an egregiously brief way, kind of trace this idea of liberation and being involved in counterpublics that kind of go against the grain of the regular institutionalized spaces in Scripture or in the story of God's self-revelation that we see in the Bible?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a really good question. Where can you see examples of counterpublic spaces? I mean, I think that the original 12 of Jesus was a counterpublic space. I think it was a space where new ideas began to flourish about who one's neighbor is, about who belongs in God's kingdom. In terms of where that you might see, I'm sure that there are, I know that there are many, many more. I think you also asked a question about where one might see that in maybe the history of liberation theology. I mean, so James Cone's book, Black Theology and Black Power, I think is maybe a textbook example of this. Black Power, when it emerged in the cry for Black Power emerged in the summer of 1968 when Stokely Carmichael, his then name was Stokely Carmichael, he was marching with Dr. King in Greenwood, Mississippi. And there were reporters there, and they asked King to reaffirm his faith in nonviolence, and he did. And Stokely Carmichael, who at that point was the kind of leader of the youth wing of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, what we call SNCC. And they got to the end, and he kind of grabbed the mic, and he was like, "We've been saying freedom for so long. What we're going to say now is Black Power." And because the press were there, they didn't know what Black Power meant. There is this revolutionary struggle. What does this mean? And no one really knew what it meant, but it was just like, and but there was a fierce response by the white media and the public to condemn Black Power, and clergy were called upon to condemn Black Power. So this is kind of the emergence of Black theology. There's a New York Times article that was published by 48 clergy, and they actually wrote a kind of theological interpretation of what power is: power in love, power in truth, power in freedom. And what I see that as them really not succumbing to the pressure of kind of a visceral reaction to this, and really kind of listening to what's being said. They formed a counterpublic. They're in conversation with sources and ideas. I think liberation theology has always done that in Latin America. They formed these communities where they would do these studies. They're called base communities, and they would model. They would have a kind of democratic kind of Bible studies where lay people could interact and discuss, and there was no kind of hierarchy between clergy and the laity. And so that was I think was a counterpublic. I think that's a space that was kind of new, imaginative. And again, I think, but I think your question about where we see instances of this in Scripture is a fascinating one that I hadn't considered before. And the first one that came to my mind, I don't know if it's right, but the first one that comes to my mind is that the 12 seem to be a kind of a counterpublic that kind of emerges on the outskirts of society to kind of rethink and reimagine ideas that perhaps within the time were considered to be, you know, unpopular or too radical or unrealistic. That's my immediate thought. But gosh, I love that question, Chase. Thanks so much for asking it.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Even as you were talking about the 12, I'm thinking of Jesus being criticized for eating among sinners, and you talking about dinner and eating spaces kind of enabling that. And who knows what they talked about, but it's interesting to imagine.
Yeah. I like that idea. Yeah.
Okay, my next question is more just about the basis of liberation theology. Some of our fellows are coming from theological spaces, some aren't. And yeah, so in terms just of understanding the entire scope of the gospel and scripture being the message of liberation, can you kind of just trace or explain that quickly for us?
Yes. You know what might be great? I think I might have it digitally. I can read, there's a passage from Gutierrez's book, Theology of Liberation, where he kind of says the entire Bible. So he makes a normative claim about like the Bible being like essentially all about this. Okay, so I can just, a Theology of Liberation. This is what he argues. Okay, here it is. The entire Bible. There it is. This is a great quote. He says, the entire Bible, beginning with the story of Cain and Abel, mirrors God's predilection, it just means God's preference, for the weak and abused of human history. This preference brings out the gratuitous or unmerited character of God's love. The same revelation is given in the evangelical Beatitudes, for they tell us with the utmost simplicity that God's predilection for the poor, the hungry, and the suffering is based on God's unmerited goodness to us. The ultimate reason for commitment to the poor and oppressed is not to be found in the social analysis we use, or in human compassion, or in any experience we ourselves may have of poverty. These are all doubtless valid motives that play an important part in our commitment. As Christians, however, our commitment is grounded in the final analysis, in the God of our faith. It is a theocentric, prophetic option that has its roots in the unmerited love of God and is demanded by this love. Bartolomé de las Casas, who had direct experience of the terrible poverty and decimation of Latin American Amerindians, explained it by saying, quote, God has the freshest and keenest memory of the least and most forgotten. I'm just going to fast forward here. He says, here it is. Okay, this is actually the very next, sorry. It says, in other words, the poor deserve preference, not because they are morally or religiously better than others, but because God is God, in whose eyes the last are first. So I think for a lot of for folks like Gutierrez, they really see this theme beginning in the book of Genesis all the way through the last are first. That's the words of Jesus. He's seeing it from the Hebrew scriptures onward, that this is just who God is, that it's part of the kind of the gracious, he says gratuitous, the gracious character of God. It's not warranted. It's not because the poor did something or the weak and abused did something to kind of earn God's favor. It's just because that's who God is. It's God's initiative to do such, um, acts of solidarity and compassion. I think, I don't know if that gets at your question.
That absolutely does.
Okay, great,
Um,
great.
and I think we see that idea of God being God and not being able to do anything but care so deeply for the poor in the incarnation and the life of Jesus as well.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one or two more questions before we open the stage for our follows. So this idea of counterpublics feels a little theoretical.
Yeah,
And
I know. I was like, I
in
hope that we get some time to talk about it because it was really technical.
Yeah, no, and I truly appreciate that. But these past few weeks in our fellowship, we've been kind of talking about identifying our emotions surrounding public theology, engagement within the public sphere, maybe some feelings of exclusion, isolation, fear, also accompanied by hope and dreaming and generation of new ideas. So, on a more personal and less theoretical level,
Yeah.
what are some emotions or characteristics that you see kind of united or commonly expressed within counterpublics?
Hmm.
What are common characteristics between people who find themselves within counterpublics?
That's such a wonderful question. The first term that came to my mind is love, a deep love. You know, we find ourselves in this space because we have been excluded from other spaces. We find ourselves in this space because we haven't given up. We haven't tapped out. We haven't decided to do this thing alone. We've decided that we're going to do this together. I found you, you found me, and um, we're committed to creating a better world because we love one another first and foremost. Not exclusively, but we love one another because we haven't been loved, and so we're gonna model that love towards one another in this space. But we don't just love one another in this space. We want to make the world better because we love those who've excluded us from this space, because we think that there's a world of intimacy that they're missing out on. I get to meet you in this space because, and I recognize how beautiful, how sincere, how kind, how imaginative you are, and they're missing out on that. And let's build together in this space um, what they wouldn't let us build out there. They're afraid, but there's something that we can offer, a kind of counter life, a counter world here in this space. We could share ideas together, ideas that they wouldn't allow us to share elsewhere. So love is the first one. Compassion for one another, tenderness. Tenderness, I think, is important. And I think we often see that as a kind of mode and not necessarily as a virtue. But I think in a lot of publics, dominant publics, it's often he who shouts the loudest is the right one. And I do mean he who shouts the loudest is often right. And I think in counterpublic spaces, I think there's a space for being tender and recognizing that an idea brought in this space, even if it hasn't been fully formed, because a lot of times these ideas are not fully formed. That's the nature of being formed by a public, and you're entering into a counterpublic and you want to try out an idea and you're not entirely sure that it makes sense. So we are tender with one another. We say, I know that we recognize that there's something behind the idea that's motivating it, right? I grant you, I kind of, not grant you, I assume not only that you love deeply, but that you think deeply as well. And so there's a kind of charity in that regard. Security, I think all those things are connected to a sense of security. We're here, we're safe, we're sharing ideas, let's test them. let's debate. Let's not just accept them because they're, because we're feeling, sensitive to each other's pain. But let's stay committed to this vision of liberation. Let's test these ideas. Let's offer counter evidence. Let's give examples. Let's see where those examples take us. What kind of roadblocks might we come up with once we start thinking through the practical implications of said idea. And I think that's an act of love. Trust, right? And ultimately, I think a lot of those things are also theological. I think that when we practice that kind of intimacy, I think we are in many ways modeling God's own attentive ear. If I were, not only does God have the keenest and freshest memory of the least and most forgotten, as in the quote that we just read, but I think God also has an ear for those who are unsure about their ideas, right? Like, I think that there's a way that God is like, I think your idea is wonderful, and I think it's possible. So, yeah, I love that question. I think that there are many emotions that I think circulate in counterpublics, and I think above all, love exists there.
Wow, thank you, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so interesting you saying that there's this world of intimacy and love that a powerful and exclusionary public is missing out on. Because I feel like, yeah, those publics are not the ones we see as poor, but I think that is describing a type of spiritual and relational poverty within these liberal publics that kind of becomes available and imagined in counter publics, and that's really beautiful. Okay, my final question for you is, in describing these elite publics that are owned by corporations and the powerful, there seems to be kind of a failure of imagination and a prevention of solidarity even. So where do you see and where do you find hope and courage within counterpublics, and what influence do you imagine them having on the world?
Well, I think that they have tremendous. First of all, I just want to register what I've just been thinking about each and every one of your questions. They are so reflective of an attentive and serious learner and interlocutor. And I just want to name that these are just remarkable questions. Like, I'm just taken by the level of care that you're interacting with in my work. So, as you were asking, I was like, these are such wonderful questions. Where does this idea might show up in Scripture? Where we might see the future impact of them. So, anyways, Chase, thank you so much for these wonderful questions. I believe the first part of your question was related to what we're missing from what publics are, kind of more general publics missing from counterpublics, and then what impact might they have on the world. Is that right? Did you want to add another aspect, or is that okay?
And if I can add, because I know that's already two big questions, but what role hope and courage play in that interaction?
Oh yeah, I think those two things are huge. You have to have the courage to imagine what's beyond the immediately available. And this is where I think faith also is also important, because you have to be able to see that which is not visible. You have to be able to see a world that's possible, that everyone is telling you is not possible. Let me just make this like concrete, maybe in one real sense. Several years ago, I was part of a book club. This was back at the University of Chicago. And I was first introduced to the idea of abolition, prison abolition, the idea that we could live in a world without prisons. And immediately the first thing that you think about is, well, what are we going to do with all those people who are behind bars? They're just going to murder everyone. They're going to harm everyone. They're going to do blah, 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 blah. And once you get over that reaction, you begin to think about other ways that we can organize society that doesn't involve putting people in cages. You can begin to explore like more and more ideas. And I think that those ideas, the ideas of prison abolition, are actually gaining, I think they're actually gaining steam. And they're not, if you're listening and if you care about human beings and believe fundamentally that a human being doesn't belong in a cage, then you can begin to imagine what reparative and restorative justice looks like. But you have to be open to that possibility. And so I think courage, you have to have the courage to name that idea in the first place. Because people, when you name these kind of radical ideas, people are going to challenge them harshly, directly. They're going to call you, again, irrational. They're not going to give you the space to actually name, to kind of lay out what it is you're actually thinking. So you do need to have courage, but your courage needs to be rooted in love. It can't be rooted in, this is not that anyone, I don't imagine a lot of people are like this, but some people can be like this. It's not rooted in, this is the edgy idea of the day. It has to be rooted in, I don't believe human beings belong in cages. I don't believe I should allow this. I don't believe the state should, just as much as I don't believe human beings should be inflicting harm on others, I don't believe the state should be inflicting harm on others, psychological, emotional, physical, etc. Hope is in the praxis, right? Hope is just not giving up. Hope is, is just it's a practice of fighting against dread. It's deciding to no longer, it's deciding to not tap out. I think hope is just deciding to it's when you can't hold on, you're still holding on. I think that's hope. Shout out to the Killers. And so I think that all of those, hope, faith, and courage, and love, I think are all, I believe are all there. But I really do think that what motivates so much of this is love, just a commitment to seeing other human beings flourish. Yeah. Even those we think are undeserving, like inmates, especially maybe those we consider to be undeserving. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Matt. Hope is not tapping out. Fellows, I hope that is what you're feeling, just emboldened and enabled to do, being in this space and in an imaginative space that we're trying to provide here with brilliant speakers such as yourself, Matt. So thank you so much.
Space becomes better when it's filled with other brilliant people like yourself and Andrew and Tekelin and all the fellows here. So I'm really feeling like this is, for me, I'm feeling energized by your questions, by your vision. Like the questions, I think for me also, I'm just gonna name it. I love your questions. And I think what I really am finding is that there's in the question, it's a kind of window to a world that you're trying to, that you want to imagine. And so that's why I'm like, oh, wow, I get a kind of vision into, or a kind of a peek through. Questions are always disclosures. And so I love your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. And prepared to have many more insightful questions coming from our fellows now. Fellows, I invite you to ask Matt your questions, and please don't hesitate. Just if you're like, I'm not sure how to use this word or this term, please just ask your question. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we will rely on your graciousness with us, Matt, as some of these words and ideas might be new.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, who would like to start us off? Friends, I welcome you to raise your hand or just unmute your mic. Yeah, Malak.
Thanks, Chase. You hear me, right? You hear me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Matthew, for this insightful presentation.
Oh,
It is
thank
my
you.
first hearing about liberation theology, and I captured the concept very well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My question is, it's a very short question. As we endeavor to counter public, how could we save ourselves from a claim of exceptionalism and from pride?
I'm sorry. How could we
save ourselves from a claim of exceptionalism as we endeavor for counter public?
from being exceptional, like exceptionality?
Exceptionalism and kind of prideful thoughts that we are different from others.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, I think that's such a wonderful question in the sense of how do we, if the aim is within the counterpublic to transform society in such a way where now I can imagine myself as being on top. I think that that's an idolatrous vision. I think that if we can imagine ourselves as people who, if we can imagine ourselves as people who are not exceptional, and we can say, this is part of the reason why why this community has formed, is because there's nothing exceptional about those within the dominant society, and we need to help them see that we are all equal under God's in God's sight. I think that needs to always be the aim, motivated by a profound sense of a profound suspicion of hierarchies, of a sense of pride. I think a lot of times there is a kind of pride and exceptionalism that is baked into a lot of major publics that I think counter publics in the best, if they're in the best ways, they need to be mindful of, you too were a slave in Egypt, you too were harmed, you too were oppressed, right? You too were one who was ostracized and made to feel less than. And so the aim is always towards striving towards an egalitarian society. Thank you for that wonderful
Thanks.
question. I think that there's a, I think what I love so much about that question, Malik, is that counterpublics are formed by people who have been excluded from publics. And so they've been formed within those publics, right? They've been formed within those spaces. You're formed in a way. How do you begin to use the tools that you were given when you can only imagine spaces, your space maybe as the right, the true, God's word, God's space. And so you begin to have imaginations of what, like, my space is going to be the one that ultimately reigns supreme. How do we rid ourselves of those spaces? And I think that it's a wonderful question, because we're formed in those ways. And this is where I think the prophets are really important, right? Do not forget that you too were a slave in Egypt. those spaces must be the spaces where we begin to cultivate counter practices as well in the public. I love that question, Malek. Thank you.
Thank you, Malak. Tizita, would you like to ask your question next?
Thank you, Dr. Vega, for your wonderful presentation. Okay.
No, thank you.
My question is, liberation theology is usually focuses on advocating for the oppressed, if I'm not mistaken. Oppressed are highly valued. So in our context, even though there are different groups that we need to advocate for them, lately, women and girls have been roughly mistreated. You know, it's been our history for a long time, but these days we are hearing almost on a weekly basis, a woman will be killed, a young girl will be raped and killed. This kind of things are pretty common. So as theologians, is there anything you can advise us on how we, the theological education centers and also the believers here in our country, is there any way we can be part of the solution for this? If you can advise us on practical points of application. Thank you.
Such a wonderful question and a really powerful question. And I mentioned earlier that liberation theology has expanded. I think the best ways that it has expanded is that some of its most poignant articulators have been women. So in Black liberation theology, I think today the best voices, the best theoreticians, the best theologians in Black theology today are women who are arguing if God, as you argued, if liberation theology is concerned for the poor and the oppressed, then we should be mindful of where the most poor and oppressed exist within the poor and the oppressed. And oftentimes, in many spaces, there are, even among oppressed spaces, there are gender hierarchies where women experience domination, sexism, patriarchy. And this is what many feminist liberation theologians have expanded and have challenged, have expanded, and have made the field of liberation theology, frankly, infinitely better today than it was then. There are, I think, throughout history, we see many times faces of liberation movements as this kind of single figure of like a male. So Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X, Oscar Romero, these are martyrs. But we often forget that their movements would not be possible without the tireless, strategic, and visionary work of the women who are always erased out of those histories, Today here in the United States, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States, that has been led by women. In Mexico City, where I stayed last year, the largest demonstration of people organizing, largest demonstration I've ever seen in my life, was on International Women's Day, 8 de Marzo, March 8th. I think, if I can just speak from a male's perspective, I think many men are a lot more afraid than they and they don't know what to do with their fear. I think women have a better sense, generally speaking, of what to do with their fear. And from my experience, I don't know if this is fair as a normative claim, but women seem to have a better sense of what to do with their fear. that they recognize that their fear can be used in productive ways. I think when men experience fear, it seems like we've been taught that our impulse should be towards violence. And oftentimes when women experience fear, they seem to have a better orientation towards using that fear in a constructive, liberatory way. And so I think that liberation theologians, or people who don't understand themselves as liberation theologians, Christians, would do themselves a much better would do themselves a solid. I don't know. No, they would be better off by forming themselves spiritually and theologically, probably first and foremost by listening to the voices of women.
Thank you for that question, Tizita.
Yes, it's a wonderful question.
Yeah, and thank you, Matt, too, for just naming that often overlooked aspect of struggles for liberation and women's involvement, and also erasure in those spaces.
Yes.
Okay, friends, I invite one or two more closing questions before we close our session together. Jacqueline, please.
Thank you, Matt. It's good to see you after a long time.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
I'm going to ask a question from our context. I mean, the tendency among Ethiopian evangelicals, probably it holds true also in the United States, is to keep theology as a kind of an in-house business, not to go to public, and this orientation has come basically because we reached a level where the institutions that we have created has become an end in their own rather than a means for a larger goal. So any sort of discussion about theology outside the four walls of the church are understood in a way as invitation of unnecessary controversies to who we are, and there is quite a lot of fear, and those of we who dare to engage theological issues outside our churches. It meant, for one thing, it's a very impressive attitude of the other to make them sort of equal to us, which we don't want to. Therefore, there is this push to keep everything within and not to engage in anything controversial and significant. So in this very context, then attempting to do brings risk. And what you are inviting us is quite a very risky venture. So what should we expect if you decide to go out? And what kind of posture should we develop in engaging the kind of criticism, ostracizations that comes afterwards? Thank you.
It's such a wonderful question, and I think that could be answered in a wide variety of ways. I think one of the ways that I imagine counterpublics forming more organically is on a far smaller scale and less inspiring scale than many might imagine. So often, like for me, I felt like my counter space took place in Bible studies. None of it was published. No one really knew about it. So no one really could actually like, it didn't seem risky to me because it was just me and like two friends who were just like talking about things together. And then slowly it kind of built where more people were coming to Bible study, more people would have conversations. Friends were kind of sharing frustrations, questions, concerns, ideas that we took seriously. That emerged, it grew a little bit bigger. I don't necessarily know that so at least as I'm imagining it, I absolutely think it's risky. I don't imagine that it's seen as, it's not, when it first forms, I don't necessarily know that it's always seemed as a big threat. Only because oftentimes they're often overlooked. No one really cares. That's part of being part of a counterpublic, is that people don't care about what you have to say. People don't care about your thoughts, your ideas. And so you kind of fly under the radar until you become a threat. And then it does become absolutely risky. It does become absolutely risky. And I think by that point, you have a community of people who love you, who care for you, who are committed to standing by you, supporting you, amplifying your voice. But I think counterpublics generally emerge as spaces that no one pays attention to, that everyone kind of is, they're loony, no one cares about them. Let's just have them do their own thing. Until you become a voice that people actually do consider to be a challenge to, and at that point it does become, I think, existentially risky. And I think what makes it a little bit more easier at that point is that you do it in community. You do it with people that you love. And your voice is a lot louder. You've got a lot more people. And so you're a lot more convinced that your visions of a future of freedom and goodness actually connects with people. And so there's something about ideas, beautiful ideas, that I think like people want to believe in. And if they don't get that, I think they're going to go to any new idea. And that could be a really toxic idea, horrible idea. So I think it's incumbent upon us to think about the more beautiful ideas. Yeah. I don't know if that gets at your question. I can't give specifics to the Ethiopian context because that's wisdom and practical vision that you really do just you've just far out. You're in a different galaxy than I am in terms of your wisdom and practical vision for Ethiopia. But I can only think about how I understand counterpublics to form organically as a kind of much smaller, much more under the radar space with just you and your friends. And I think that where two or more are gathered, there the Spirit of the Lord is. And I think the spirit of liberation can generate and create some fascinating traction with those ideas.
Thank you. Starting small is quite a helpful idea. It tells us how to begin, and not only that, it also gives us sort of a community, a shoulder to cry on when something happens. Thank you.
Yeah, this feels to me like a counterpublic space. This space to me feels like a counterpublic space. It feels like this is what we're all discussing kind of theoretically is happening right here. Different ideas, new ideas, building on those ideas, thinking about where they might go elsewhere. I think those are, this is actually a counterpublic space.
Matt, I was wondering if you have time for one last question.
Yeah.
10 more minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, this is a question from Robel. who has no power in his office right now.
Oh,
But
yeah.
I think it would be a great question to segue us into this next week, where we're going to be hearing from David Kataba from Telos. And he's going to be presenting on nonviolence and public theology. So kind of building the bridge between this week on liberation theology, next week on nonviolence. Well done, Robel. You really anticipated that for us. Robel says, how does liberation theology see the use of violence as affecting change, both from theoretical and from practical perspectives, such as experience in Latin American liberation movements?
It's a really wonderful question. And liberation theologians have, I think every single liberation theologian has a different perspective on this. Every single one. There are some who are absolutely committed to nonviolence. Even figures that we kind of consider to be like proto-liberation theologians, or some who are like liberation theology adjacent. So let's say Martin Luther King Jr., for example, right? Absolutely committed to nonviolence, but carried a pistol on him. What was that about, right? We don't know. Oscar Romero, right? The violence of love, criticized, talked about, criticized the use of violence as a way of achieving liberation, but also struggled and wrestled with and wrote publicly about just war theory and making sense of when he's a Catholic, and a lot of Catholics, official position still of the Catholic Church is that a war is just if it meets different criteria. And Romero believed that. We imagine him as kind of this archetype of nonviolence, but he also believed that there were exceptions, that there were rare exceptions. There are it also really boils down to a lot of it, not always. A lot of it is often about how we understand violence, the nature of violence. A lot of theologians, I know Cohn and others, really inspired by the work of the psychotherapist from oh my gosh, what's his name? Wrote The Wretched of the Earth. Who am I thinking of? I read his book in Richard Miller's class.
Frantz Fanon.
Frantz Fanon, yeah. This idea that colonial society is inherently violent in every way. Even the mailman, for example, who delivers your mail, if he's there illegally and is not necessarily a combatant, he's enacting violence upon you. Because so a lot of that, a lot of liberation theologians have just completely different views about the role and use of violence. I think I too think that it needs to begin there with, first and foremost, how we understand nonviolence or violence. And I think given that, if we want to be committed to nonviolence, which I do, that our primary, or maybe our principal, or and sometimes, and I think in many cases, we might even say exclusively, need to direct our critiques of violence against those with the monopoly on violence. Right? Martin Luther King Jr. realized at the latter days of his life. He said, I realized I could not raise my voice against those who were, I can't remember exactly how he put it. I realized I can't raise my voice against the people who are, I can't tell poor ghettoized Black people to be nonviolent while being silent against what he says is the greatest purveyor of violence in the history of the world, my own government. Got him in a lot of trouble for saying that. But that was a position he landed on at the end of his life, that And I remember a friend of mine, Palestinian theologian Mitri Raheb, has said something similar, that Palestinians are routinely asked and taught to be nonviolent, and he was like, "No, the government needs to be taught to be nonviolent." So I think Christians should think. It raises other theological questions about, is the norm of nonviolence for Christians only because we're Christian, or is the norm of nonviolence a Christian norm that we believe is good for the world? If we believe that it's the latter, if we believe that it's the former, that's just for Christians, then we should only be preaching it to other Christians and not to people who are not. If we believe that it's the norm that we believe is good for the world, then it really makes sense to me that we ought to be directing most of our critique, if not exclusively our critique, on states and not just individuals as well. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but some immediate thoughts. Yeah, no, thank you for your wonderful question. It's a question that I think every Christian needs to be thinking about. I don't know how you can live your life as a Christian and see the immiseration of so many people and not be thinking about violence, both as a legitimate response or an illegitimate response, illegitimate or legitimate, but just violence generally. Why is there so much violence around us? And by the way, I see depriving people of food, education, equitable preventative healthcare, gainful employment as a form of violence. I think that those things are absolutely violent. I think the way that countries treat other countries, people internally treat people within their country, when they deprive them of basic necessities of living, those are forms of violence. And I think that the Christian who's committed to nonviolence, when they're condemning these injustices, I think that they're living out the ethic of nonviolence that Jesus preaches. I think that this is really where I think we may need to reimagine what the ethic of nonviolence calls us to do and be. Thank you. I kind of rambled at that last end, but
thank you for welcoming us, Matt, into a complexity and just really nuanced vision of nonviolence as we prepare to talk more about it next week. Really appreciate it.
Well, I'm send my love and greetings. I don't know if it's David, right? I've met David.
Yeah.
I don't know if he remembers me, but send my greetings to David. And so cool. I got to see some people that I consider friends and respect. Munter, Isaac. I saw that you all were in conversation with Munter, and just you all are just doing. I wish I had a program like this. I really do. I wish I had people that I could talk, learn from, talk to, think about these just really important questions of Christian faith. I think when I was a student in undergrad, it was just like, what did Karl Barth say about, this thing? But whatever. Not hating on Barth, but this group is way more interesting than Karl Barth.
Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. And we're so glad that you can be a part of it with us.
Thank you all.
Matt,
yeah.
I was just gonna say, take a quick picture before we go. Everyone, if you'd be willing to turn your camera on just for a second. This has become kind of our ending tradition in the past few weeks. Give it a second. Hi, Galata. Hi, Absara. Love seeing everyone's faces. Okay, if everyone could give me a big smile.
Everyone's so beautiful.
Awesome. Okay, got the picture.
Thank you all.
Yeah, Matt, once again, you have invited us into a form of imagination that is wonderfully unreasonable and impossible and too radical. So thank you for boldly inviting us into that with you.
Oh, thank you, Chase. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Techland. Thank you, all, every single one of the fellows. Thank you so much for inviting me into this space to share with you. You all are such a lovely group of world changers for real. This feels like a transformative space. So thank you for inviting me to be a part of it.
Absolutely. Okay, we're gonna end with our 10 seconds of silence once again. And then I'll say a quick blessing and we can all head on our Saturdays. Friends, until next week, may you discern what is yours to say and yours to do, guided by courage and held in love. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matt.
all.
Love you, brother.
Thank you so
Grateful
much.
for you all.
Take care.
Bye.